Most people assume that controlling blood pressure is all about cutting salt, but what I see nearly every week in the emergency department challenges that belief in ways that are hard to believe. I'll check someone's blood pressure and see numbers like 160/95, and naturally my concern spikes. So, I start with the usual questions. What's your diet like? I ask. Oh, I eat really well, they respond. Lots of vegetables, home-cooked meals, I don't add any salt. Then comes the question about exercise. I walk 5,000 steps most days, sometimes more. I check their medication list next. Perhaps they're already on blood pressure medicine, yet it's clearly not doing enough. And there I stand, looking at someone who on paper seems to be doing everything right, and yet the numbers are stubbornly high. This is where the frustration hits. They aren't exaggerating or misrepresenting their lifestyle. They genuinely eat healthily, they genuinely exercise, they've cut out salt, they've committed to cardio, they've done everything they were instructed to do. And yet, the one reward they expected, their blood pressure normalizing, hasn't materialized. What's really happening is subtle but powerful. Even while they limit all the obvious dietary triggers, a hormonal system runs quietly in the background, turning on every few hours and instructing their kidneys to hold on to sodium, no matter how little salt is in their diet. Most people never even realize this process exists. I'm Dr. Pradip Jamnadas, and over the past decade, working in the emergency department, I've become fascinated by a fundamental question. How do we live longer and healthier in a healthcare system designed to treat disease after it arises, instead of preventing it from developing in the first place? What I want to share with you today is a concept that rarely enters conversations about blood pressure, longevity, and metabolic health. It's not about adding a supplement or removing a particular food from your plate. The key lies in timing, specifically whether your body ever has the chance to reset the hormonal systems that regulate blood pressure in the first place. From years of observing patients in the A&E and studying the physiology behind these mechanisms, I've discovered a striking reality. You can follow all the conventional advice perfectly and still struggle with persistently elevated blood pressure if you unknowingly disrupt one critical rhythm in how you eat throughout the day. Let's start by exploring why doing everything right often doesn't work. Imagine a typical patient. They've eliminated ultra-processed foods, they avoid adding salt to their meals, and they walk between 5,000 and 10,000 steps daily. Their diet is objectively healthy whole grains, lean proteins, plenty of vegetables, and fruit for snacks. They don't overconsume alcohol, and they usually get decent sleep. On paper, these habits should protect them from high blood pressure. And yet, when we measure their blood pressure, it consistently sits above the recommended range. This mismatch is confusing and frustrating because these individuals have followed the advice, committed to the changes, and expected the natural reward, normal readings. When it doesn't happen, the instinct is to double down. They slash salt intake even further. They add more cardio. They eat cleaner than ever. Sometimes the numbers budge slightly, but often they remain stubbornly elevated. Here's why. For many people, blood pressure isn't merely a volume issue. If it were, reducing sodium would consistently work, because less sodium means less water retention, which reduces blood volume, lowering pressure. This approach works for some, but not for everyone. In countless individuals, particularly those with subtle metabolic compromises they might not even know exist, blood pressure is driven by something else entirely. Persistent hormonal signaling. Systems that should rise and fall throughout the day instead remain elevated almost continuously. When that happens, the body's pressure control system never gets a chance to stand down. Now, let's focus on insulin, not in the conventional sense you may have heard before. Most discussions revolve around how much insulin the body produces, whether someone is insulin resistant, or if the pancreas is struggling to keep up. Why those factors matter There's an equally critical dimension that often goes unnoticed: the pattern of insulin secretion throughout the day. Insulin is meant to be pulsatile. It spikes when we eat, moves glucose into cells, and then falls back to baseline once its job is done. This rise and fall isn't just about blood sugar. It's a signal to multiple systems in the body about the current physiological state. When insulin rises, it instructs the kidneys to retain sodium, keeps the sympathetic nervous system slightly more active, and influences blood vessel reactivity. All of this is normal and appropriate when the spike follows a meal and resolves a few hours later. Problems arise when insulin never drops, when it remains elevated for 12, 14, or even 16 hours each day because people consume food or drinks that stimulate insulin every 2 to 3 hours from the moment they wake until bedtime. Modern eating patterns have made this almost the default. Breakfast, mid-morning snack, lunch, afternoon snack, dinner, evening snack, sometimes even a late-night bite. Few of us experience true hunger anymore. Even if every single meal or snack is healthy, choosing whole foods and avoiding processed products, insulin still spikes 6 or 7 times daily. Because these occasions are spaced closely together, insulin never fully returns to baseline. The result is chronic, low-grade insulin elevation, not high enough to trigger immediate symptoms or show up as diabetes, but enough to alter kidney function, blood vessel behavior, and autonomic nervous system activity over weeks, months, and years. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism confirms that even in people without diabetes, frequent eating throughout the day keeps insulin elevated, preventing it from following its normal pulsatile pattern. When a hormone like insulin stays high for extended periods, it behaves very differently from its natural spike and fall rhythm. Chronically elevated insulin sends constant signals to the kidneys, instructing them to retain sodium. It tells the sympathetic nervous system to maintain a higher baseline of activity. The inner lining of blood vessels, the endothelium, loses its chance to relax properly, which affects vascular flexibility. Each of these changes nudges blood pressure upward. When combined, they create a persistent state of elevated pressure, even when blood volume isn't particularly high, dietary sodium is moderate, and other cardiovascular habits are on point. To understand this more concretely, it helps to zoom in on the kidneys, because this is where the regulation of blood pressure truly takes place. Kidneys are sophisticated organs, but they don't see the food you eat. They respond to hormonal signals. Elevated insulin acts like a clear instruction. Retain sodium. This happens via specific mechanisms in the nephron, the kidney's functional units, where insulin directly enhances sodium reabsorption in the proximal tubule and the collecting duct. Research published in Hypertension, the Journal of the American Heart Association, demonstrates that insulin directly activates the epithelial sodium channel in the collecting duct, increasing sodium retention regardless of dietary intake. This isn't a flaw in the system, it's an evolutionary adaptation. Holding onto sodium temporarily makes perfect sense when we eat. Carbohydrate-rich meals, for instance, require more blood volume to manage digestion, nutrient absorption, and metabolic processing. A temporary increase in sodium retention ensures the body can maintain this volume. The problem arises because our bodies evolved for intermittent eating with long gaps between meals. In that context, insulin spikes were brief, sodium retention was temporary, and the system self-corrected. In modern life, insulin is elevated almost constantly, so this temporary mechanism becomes chronic. The kidneys remain locked in retention mode, holding on to sodium regardless of intake. This explains why some people can follow a strict low-sodium diet, yet still have high blood pressure. Sodium restriction matters, but if the hormonal signal driving retention is continuously active, cutting dietary salt is like trying to empty a bathtub while the faucet remains on. You slow the fill, but the tub never empties. This mechanism also clarifies another confusing pattern seen in patients. Some have higher blood pressure in the morning than in the evening, or sudden spikes that don't match obvious triggers like stress or activity. The reason often lies in fluctuating insulin levels. Even a seemingly small late-night snack like fruit, nuts, or a light smoothie can keep insulin elevated into the early morning hours. The kidneys remain in sodium retention mode upon waking, creating morning hypertension. Patients are baffled because they believe they've done everything right. We also tend to make the mistake of judging metabolic health by outward appearance. Normal BMI and visible fitness are not reliable indicators of internal metabolic function. Advanced imaging reveals that many seemingly fit individuals actually have excessive visceral fat, the fat surrounding internal organs, especially the liver. This fat is metabolically active, unlike subcutaneous fat that lies beneath the skin. Studies, including one in obesity research with over 3,000 participants, show that roughly 1 in 4 people with normal BMI still has metabolic abnormalities typically associated with obesity, including insulin resistance and hypertension. Visceral fat produces inflammatory signals and disrupts insulin signaling in the liver, a major driver of chronic insulin elevation. A person can have a normal BMI, run marathons, and still have a fatty liver contributing to insulin resistance. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin, which then triggers all the downstream effects we've discussed: sodium retention, sympathetic nervous system activation, and impaired vascular relaxation. The result? Elevated blood pressure that seems to appear out of nowhere. Certain populations are particularly vulnerable. Women during menopause often experience shifts in body composition, losing muscle, and gaining visceral fat, even if their overall weight remains stable. Chronic sleep deprivation promotes visceral fat accumulation. Moderate alcohol intake, stress, and even some lifestyle habits contribute further to insulin resistance. All of these factors can make someone who looks healthy on the outside operate on the wrong hormonal settings internally, especially when it comes to blood pressure regulation. This brings us to a critical point that's often overlooked when discussing blood pressure and metabolic health. We tend to use visible factors like body mass index, BMI, or fitness levels as proxies for someone's metabolic state. If someone has a normal BMI, exercises regularly, and looks fit, we automatically assume their internal metabolic processes are functioning just fine. However, this assumption can be misleading. Emerging research is showing that there's a significant subset of individuals who, despite having a normal BMI, have what's known as metabolically obese normal weight. These individuals appear healthy on the outside, but have excessive visceral fat around their organs, especially the liver. And this visceral fat is metabolically active, unlike the fat under your skin that you can pinch. A large study published in the Journal of Obesity Research involving over 3,000 participants found that roughly 1 in 4 people with a normal BMI actually have metabolic abnormalities typically associated with obesity. This includes insulin resistance, high blood pressure, and even an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. What's alarming is that visceral fat releases inflammatory signals interfering with insulin's job, especially in the liver. When this happens, the liver becomes resistant to insulin, and the pancreas has to produce more of it to maintain normal blood sugar levels. The result is an overproduction of insulin, which then sets off a cascade of events that ultimately raise blood pressure. Imagine this. You could be running marathons, have a normal BMI, and eat what you think is a perfectly balanced diet, but still struggle with high blood pressure because you have a fatty liver that's driving insulin resistance. This isn't some rare anomaly. It's actually more common than you might think, especially in certain groups. For instance, women going through menopause often experience a shift in body composition where they lose muscle mass and gain visceral fat, even if their weight stays the same. People who are chronically sleep deprived also tend to accumulate visceral fat more easily. Moderate alcohol consumption, often considered harmless by health-conscious individuals, contributes to fatty liver and insulin resistance. Even stress, with its ability to elevate cortisol, encourages fat to settle around the abdomen and internal organs. This makes a big difference when it comes to blood pressure regulation. Many of the individuals I see in the emergency department who look fit and healthy on the outside are still dealing with elevated blood pressure because their internal metabolic machinery isn't functioning as it should. And that's the problem with relying on outward signs to gauge metabolic health. Just because someone looks healthy doesn't mean their metabolic systems are optimized. It's crucial to understand that blood pressure isn't just about how much salt you eat or how much you exercise. The hidden culprit is often the hormonal environment that drives these systems in the background. And in many cases, insulin is the key player. If insulin levels are chronically elevated because of underlying metabolic dysfunction, whether it's from visceral fat, poor sleep, stress, or even moderate alcohol consumption, the body never gets the chance to reset its pressure regulation systems. And that's why some people do everything right on paper, eating healthily, exercising regularly, and still face stubbornly high blood pressure. This leads us to the mistake most health-conscious people make: constant feeding. Yes, constant feeding. If you're eating or drinking something that stimulates insulin release every few hours throughout the day, you're preventing insulin from falling back to baseline, which means your kidneys never get the signal to release sodium, your blood vessels stay tense, and your sympathetic nervous system remains activated. This is the fundamental mistake that leads to persistently high blood pressure despite all the efforts you're making to eat right and stay active. So, what does constant feeding look like? It's eating small meals or snacks throughout the day, something we've all been taught is essential for maintaining energy levels or boosting metabolism. We've been told that eating every 2 to 3 hours is the best way to keep our blood sugar stable, but research is now showing that it's the opposite. Constantly feeding your body triggers insulin release over and over, keeping it elevated for long periods of time, which disrupts the hormonal systems that regulate blood pressure. And let's not forget liquid calories. Smoothies, protein shakes, juices, or even a glass of wine. All of these can be problematic, even if they seem healthy. They trigger insulin release, just like solid food. But because they're liquid, they're absorbed faster, leading to sharper insulin spikes and longer durations of elevated insulin levels. Even something as simple as a handful of almonds or a piece of fruit can keep insulin elevated if consumed between meals, preventing your body from entering the fasted state where metabolic recalibration can take place. Late night snacking is particularly troublesome because it extends insulin elevation into the hours when your body should be in deep metabolic rest. Eating close to bedtime, even a small snack, keeps insulin elevated for hours after, meaning your kidneys remain in sodium retention mode throughout the night. The result? You wake up with already elevated blood pressure, making it much harder for your body to reset. So, let's break this down. The core issue here isn't about eating too much or even eating the wrong foods. In fact, the foods themselves might be perfectly healthy. The problem is how often you eat them. The key issue is the timing of insulin secretion. If you're eating every few hours, you're triggering insulin release too frequently, and that keeps it elevated for extended periods. As a result, your kidneys, blood vessels, and sympathetic nervous system never get the opportunity to reset properly. What we really need is to create windows during the day where insulin can fall back to baseline. When insulin falls, it signals your kidneys to release sodium, your sympathetic nervous system to downregulate, and your blood vessels to relax. You don't need to take any extra supplements or eat special foods to make this happen. All you have to do is allow for long enough periods between meals so that insulin can drop and your body's systems can reset. The most straightforward way to do this is to condense your eating window. If you're currently eating from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., consider narrowing that down to a 10 or 1-2 hour window. That might mean skipping the mid-morning snack, waiting until midday for your first meal, or finishing dinner by 7 p.m. and avoiding any snacks after that. The exact timing of your meals matters less than the principle, which is to give your body a chance to experience a period where insulin levels can fall to baseline and your internal systems can recalibrate. In fact, studies have shown that restricting eating to a 10-hour window without changing what you eat can significantly reduce blood pressure, improve cholesterol levels, and enhance glucose regulation. This was demonstrated in research published in Cell Metabolism, where participants experienced a reduction in blood pressure and better metabolic health simply by compressing their eating window. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require drastic changes to your diet. You don't have to eliminate foods or restrict calories. Just give your body the time it needs to reset by allowing for longer fasting periods. When insulin drops during fasting windows, several key things happen. Sodium excretion increases, reducing blood volume and thereby lowering blood pressure. The sympathetic nervous system, which keeps your body on high alert, gets a break, helping to lower your heart rate and relax your blood vessels. The endothelium, the inner lining of your blood vessels, gets a chance to produce nitric oxide, which helps maintain proper vascular flexibility and allows your blood vessels to relax. All of these changes work together to help reduce blood pressure and improve overall cardiovascular health. Now, timing matters not just for eating, but also for exercise. It's not just about burning calories or improving fitness. Exercise can play a key role in improving insulin sensitivity, which helps lower insulin levels. For several hours after moderate exercise, especially resistance training or high-intensity cardio, your muscles become more sensitive to insulin. This means your body needs less insulin to control blood sugar, which in turn reduces sodium retention and helps lower blood pressure. Exercise is a powerful tool for regulating blood pressure, but it's most effective when it's timed well. If you eat a carbohydrate-rich meal before or after exercise, you take advantage of the body's heightened insulin sensitivity, meaning you'll need less insulin for the same effect on blood sugar. This minimizes the duration of insulin elevation, which is crucial for maintaining healthy blood pressure. But exercise alone isn't enough. Sleep, as simple as it sounds, is a non-negotiable piece of the puzzle. Sleep is when your body performs most of its hormonal recalibration. Growth hormone levels rise, cortisol drops, and insulin sensitivity improves. Studies have shown that just 4 nights of sleep restriction can reduce insulin sensitivity by about 30% in healthy adults. If you're chronically undersleeping, even if you're following the best diet and exercise routine, your body will be operating in a higher insulin resistance state. This means you'll need more insulin to regulate blood sugar, which leads to more sodium retention and higher blood pressure. Sleep isn't just rest, it's active metabolic repair. If you're not sleeping well, even if you're doing everything else right, you're fighting an uphill battle. Proper sleep is essential to optimize blood pressure and overall metabolic health. Now, let's ground all of this in a practical, real-world example. I've seen patients come through the emergency department with blood pressure readings that are concerning systolic pressures in the 160s or even higher, despite being on 1 or 2 blood pressure medications that aren't enough to control it. When we dig into their history, we often find that they're eating healthy, they're active, and they're managing stress. But here's the key. They're eating all day long. Breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack, sometimes a protein shake or smoothie thrown in there. So what's happening? Insulin is elevated for 14 to 16 hours a day, and the kidneys never get a chance to offload sodium. What's remarkable is how quickly things can change when these patients simply change their eating patterns. I've seen people who make no changes to their diet, exercise, or medication, but compress their eating into an 8 or 10-hour window, and within weeks, their blood pressure drops. This isn't a placebo effect. It's the body finally getting the hormonal signals it needs to reset. The kidneys release sodium, the sympathetic nervous system calms down, and blood vessels regain their flexibility. The result? A noticeable reduction in blood pressure. Let's take a moment to address the broader implications of all of this. Because the impact of resetting your insulin levels and allowing your blood pressure regulation systems to function properly extends far beyond just blood pressure. Elevated blood pressure isn't just a number on a monitor, it's a direct measure of the strain your cardiovascular system is under every day. When blood pressure is chronically elevated, your heart works harder to pump blood throughout your body, which over time can lead to left ventricular hypertrophy, thickening of the heart muscle. This thickening reduces the heart's ability to pump blood efficiently and increases the risk of heart failure. Your blood vessels are also under constant pressure, which damages the endothelium, the inner lining of your arteries. This contributes to the development of atherosclerosis, increasing the risk of heart attack, stroke, and other cardiovascular diseases. The kidneys are exposed to higher pressures as well, which accelerates kidney damage and raises the risk of chronic kidney disease. These are well-known risks, and we already understand that chronic high blood pressure accelerates the onset of these diseases. But what's less appreciated is that the same hormonal dysfunction that drives high blood pressure, persistent insulin elevation, sympathetic nervous system activation, and endothelial dysfunction also contributes to a range of other serious metabolic conditions. For instance, insulin resistance and chronic high blood pressure are strongly linked to type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, and even Alzheimer's disease. A meta-analysis published in Diabetes Care, which examined data from over 100,000 participants, found that insulin resistance independently increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, even in people who don't have diabetes. So, the mechanism driving high blood pressure, insulin resistance, and the hormonal dysfunction it causes is the same one that underlies a host of other chronic diseases. This isn't a series of unrelated conditions. They're all different manifestations of the same metabolic dysfunction, which is fundamentally about insulin mismanagement. The good news is that by addressing insulin resistance, particularly by altering your eating patterns, you can not only lower your blood pressure, but also reduce your risk of many of these chronic diseases. This is the real price. By optimizing the timing of your meals and giving your body the chance to reset insulin levels, you're reducing the risk of nearly every major disease that shortens lifespan and impairs quality of life as you age.